From advanced technology comes a new kind of luxury car, the first front-wheel drive Chrysler New Yorker.
Back in 1939, Chrysler introduced what would become its longest-running model, the New Yorker. Lasting for 14 generations, it took over as Chrysler's flagship luxury model in 1976, following the end of the Imperial brand, and struggled to compete against rivals at Cadillac and Lincoln. Thanks to the gas crisis and impending bankruptcy, the New Yorker devolved into yet another K-car variant in the 1980s. Its final form, as one of Chrysler's cab-forward LH cars, was short-lived, and the name quietly retired after 57 years in 1996. This is the story of the Chrysler New Yorker. This is my old car.
Smooth, quiet ride, and so reliable it's protected for 5 years or 50,000 miles. The Chrysler New Yorker.
All monitored systems are functioning.
Before I get started, a quick shout out to Martin, a 19-year-old viewer from Slovakia who reached out to me via Instagram with a link to a quiz he created in Kahoot, an online learning game platform with trivia questions about my channel. I'll include a link in the description below. This is very clever and I truly appreciate the effort. For those of you who have been hoping for an episode about the New Yorker, you can all thank this particular viewer, as his many repeated requests definitely got him noticed when it came time for me to do my next Chrysler episode. Although technically I included the New Yorker in a previous episode. That was my episode on the Dodge Intrepid, which was among my first 6 episodes that inspired my channel's name, since I owned 2 Intrepids in the 1990s. The New Yorker was a variation of the Intrepid's LH platform in 1994, and today, that version may be the last one that some of you have ever seen. The name New Yorker originally evolved from the 1938 Chrysler New York Special Series, which was a sub-series of the Chrysler Imperial. This somewhat long name was often shortened to just New Yorker, which led to the model name officially changing to that for the following year. The Chrysler Imperial, which started in 1926, remained the flagship, with the New Yorker still being a luxury-themed model, but a bit less expensive option, making it more of a competitor to Buick, Oldsmobile, and Mercury, whereas the Imperial competed with Cadillac, Lincoln, and Packard. Chrysler back then didn't have its own luxury brand, resulting in the eventual spin-off of the Imperial name to be its own brand in 1955. Which allowed the New Yorker to become the Chrysler brand's top-end model. During those early years, the New Yorker was available in 5 different body styles, including 2 and 4-door hardtop models, a popular option in the 1950s, which eliminated the B-pillar for a more open and sportier feel.
Mr. Bascom can't drive, he doesn't have a license!
As was common back in the 50s and 60s, as automakers often used the tactic of planned obsolescence to get more repeat buyers. The New Yorker went through several generations that follow the typical trends of the day.
See? All the controls are on your left, away from the children.
Danger, Will Robinson! Danger!
Including big tail fins in the late 50s, to quickly eliminating them starting in 1962, as fins had fallen out of favor across the big 3 automakers. But the one consistency they had over these years was size, maintaining a length of at least 18 feet long through the 1960s.
The 65 is the most beautiful Chrysler ever built. 18 feet of comfort. 2 tons of security.
And of course, big V8s with big displacement was par for the course, in an era where gas was cheap and plentiful.
In this New Yorker, a 413 cubic inch V8 is standard equipment.
By 1969, the New Yorker had gained 6 more inches, and like many of its competitors, the opulent luxury of days long gone was replaced with lots of fake wood and obvious cost cutting, as Chrysler struggled to compete with Ford and GM. However, the biggest hit to the New Yorker came in 1973, when the 9th generation New Yorker debuted for the 1974 model year. The timing here was horrible, as they had a new model launch with an even bigger New Yorker that year, just as the OPEC oil embargo hit, and big cars were now a huge liability.
See the 1974 Chrysler New Yorker. A totally new expression of an idea that has never changed.
Chrysler now offered their biggest New Yorker ever, over 19 feet long. Those loyal to Mopar stuck with them, but overall sales slid. Especially for large cars like the New Yorker, which by 1976 had to take on the role of Chrysler's flagship model, as the entire Imperial brand, once Chrysler's luxury division, was eliminated in an effort to consolidate and keep the company alive.
Yes, yes, we're gonna say yes. We're your Chrysler Plymouth dealer.
V8 engine displacements were still huge, with a 440 cubic inch 7.2 liter optional in 1978, just so it could move well over 2.5 tons. During the mid-70s, continued sales declined. Chrysler simply didn't have the money to completely redesign their cars to make them more fuel efficient. By the end of the decade, both Ford and GM were introducing downsized models, But for the New Yorker, to maintain its flagship status, Chrysler re-engineered their C-body platform, which had been in use since 1965, to become the R-body for 1979. Although it was smaller, it only lost less than a foot in length.
Chrysler New Yorker for 1979.
Chrysler put a smaller, weaker V8 and removed the door frames to save a few pounds. The latter change looking very odd on the rear doors when they tried to maintain the opera window in the Landau top, but also remove the frame around the window that could be lowered. High-end models were referred to as the New Yorker Fifth Avenue, and overall sales for 1979 managed almost 55,000. But continued financial hardship meant a price increase for 1980, and sales tanked to only 6,500 for 1981, leading to the R-body being considered back then and now as a huge failure. Chrysler was living on a 1979 government bailout that was spearheaded by Lee Iacocca,
My excuse for coming to you is real simple. I'm running out of money, and I'm going to have to shut down.
who would usher in big changes for the New Yorker to make Chrysler profitable again. 1982 and 83 were transitional years for the New Yorker, and likely a confusing time for buyers. Although sharing platforms across divisions was commonplace, not just at Chrysler, but also GM and Ford, the 80s proved to be a time where this practice was seriously abused. Chrysler's new M-body platform, now shrunk to about 17 feet in length, was used for the New Yorker, as well as the Dodge Diplomat and Plymouth Grand Fury. The latter two I discussed more in my earlier Dodge Diplomat episode.
You guys are the dumbest bounty hunters I've ever seen!
The M-body had previously been used for the Chrysler LeBaron, but for 1982, the LeBaron moved to the cheaper and smaller K-Car platform. The Fifth Avenue name was still being used for the higher trim version of the New Yorker in 1982, but for 1983, just to really confuse things, the M-body model became the New Yorker Fifth Avenue, and a stretched version of the K-Car, now called the E-body, became the New Yorker.
A whole new class of automobile, the Chrysler E-Class, Chrysler's largest front-wheel drive sedans.
Just a year later, 1984, the M-body model was renamed the Chrysler Fifth Avenue, so now the New Yorker name was on the smaller, four-cylinder model, marking the first year since 1955 that the New Yorker was no longer Chrysler's flagship model, and it became the first Chrysler branded model with a four-cylinder engine since 1932. The K-Car platform is probably best known for the smaller Dodge Aries and Plymouth Reliant models, which Chrysler heavily marketed in the 1980s, and were a key factor in making Chrysler profitable again.
Aries K from Dodge, Reliant K from Plymouth.
But cars like the New Yorker also used a variation of the K-Car platform, as did smaller cars like the Dodge Daytona. Even the Chrysler minivans utilized some of the K-Car design, making it one of the most proliferant platforms of any automaker. But having the New Yorker use a modified K-Car platform and being effectively demoted thanks to the Fifth Avenue becoming a separate and larger model, the New Yorker name from that point on would never have the status it once held. Chrysler still tried to sell the luxury look with the padded Landau roof and opera lights as standard, yet features such as air conditioning and power windows were an extra cost option, virtually unheard of today. Despite the downgrade, the New Yorker was still included among the many ads that Chrysler did in the 80s, which featured actor Ricardo Montalban.
These cars caught the competition sleeping.
Although these ads are now more or less 40 years old, I think it is safe to say that anyone who grew up in the 80s, as I did, still remember them.
Everyone asks, Corinthian leather? Of course, why not the best?
But the early 80s was also the start of the home computer revolution, so Chrysler tried to capitalize on the public interest in the new technology by offering audible alerts.
Your fuel is low.
Essentially a recorded voice that alerts the driver to such things as a door being ajar,
A door is ajar.
or even saying that all systems were working properly.
All monitored systems are functioning.
Fortunately, none of my biofunctions seem affected.
Although it may have seemed state-of-the-art at the time, it didn't take long for these gimmicky screens and voices to be mocked and generally hated by most drivers.
I'd suggest you shut that drawer.
The drawer is ajar. The drawer is ajar. The drawer is a...
So they were phased out across all the Chrysler models within the next few years.
Is that Marvin?
Sales of the New Yorker managed to average around 60,000 per year during the 1980s, up until a new design was available in 1988. Those extra sales may have been what led Chrysler to continue offering the previous gen model along with the new for 1988, with the older body style being branded as the New Yorker Turbo, as the new model would be offered with a V6 engine. With the worst of the gas crisis in the past, the latest New Yorker, now in its 13th generation, moved to the larger C-body, which added about 5 inches in length from the previous model, yet it still was nearly 3 feet shorter than it was in the mid-70s. The C-body New Yorker, which itself was still related to the original K-Car platform, still remained under the Fifth Avenue in the Chrysler model rankings. Although 1989 would represent the New Yorker's 50th anniversary, Chrysler never offered any form of anniversary edition, so although at the time it had been the longest running nameplate, Chrysler clearly didn't see any need to advertise it. The following year, 1990, Chrysler would make some more changes just to confuse things again. The name Imperial was brought back, not as its own brand as it once was, but as a new model to replace the Fifth Avenue. However, the Fifth Avenue name didn't entirely go away, as Chrysler offered a stretched wheelbase version of the New Yorker and called it the New Yorker Fifth Avenue. Despite the confusing name changes, they were going to be short-lived anyway, as Chrysler was working on a new full-size car platform that would be a complete departure from the squared-off look that had been standard across most of their lineup for the past decade. The new platform, known as LH, would introduce a new styling direction that Chrysler called cab forward by pushing the windshield farther out over the front hood, and the overall length increased by over a foot. Initially, there were 3 models for the 1994 model year that shared the LH platform: the Dodge Intrepid, Chrysler Concorde, and the Eagle Vision. About 6 months after the release of those 3 initial models, 2 additional Chrysler-branded LH models were released with a more formal-looking upright rear window, and were named the LHS and the New Yorker. Although the name New Yorker had already diluted somewhat during the 1980s, this final iteration was clearly designed for their older customers, hence the idea to use a name that had been in their lineup for over 50 years. Although the New Yorker was the same shape and size as the LHS had front bucket seats, a slightly stiffer suspension, and less chrome trim, whereas the New Yorker had a front bench seat to allow 3 cross seating, a softer suspension, and more exterior chrome, presumably to make it more attractive to their older clientele. But not surprisingly, the LHS sales were far higher than the New Yorker, resulting in the New Yorker being discontinued for the 1996 model year. No celebrations or special editions to highlight the fact that the New Yorker name was the longest running model Chrysler ever had. Instead, the New Yorker simply didn't exist for 1997. Having a car nameplate last for over 50 years is rare nowadays. The Ford Mustang will soon reach 60 years, the Chevy Corvette recently made it to 70 years, and the Chevy Suburban is about to hit 90 years, as it was first sold in 1934. Today, if you are younger than the millennial generation, you may not even recognize a New Yorker on the road, if you can find one. But if you're a boomer, you may still remember riding in a classic New Yorker as a kid, back when the name New Yorker, for a car anyway, was truly synonymous with luxury. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel.
Sunday driver!
If you once owned a car from the 80s to mid-2000s that you barely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.